Your hosts have earned a reputation as fierce and effective advocates inside and outside of the courtroom. Both partners are experienced trial attorneys who have been board certified in family law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to the For Better, Worse, or Divorce podcast, where we provide you tips and insights on how to navigate divorce and child custody situations. I'm Brian Walters, here with Jake Gilbreath. We're the managing partners of Walters Gilbreath PLLC, as you can probably tell by the name. And we're celebrating our 98th episode today. If you follow along, you'll know that about every 10 episodes or so, we like to recap some of our recent episodes and discuss any recent family law news, as well as talk about what's to come in the next 10 episodes or so. And we'll also answer some listener questions toward the end. So let's talk about some recent favorites. Jake, do you have any that come to mind on your end of things?
Yeah, we did. So two, and they actually both kind of relate to my two favorite themes, which is, first of all, there's a good friend and former client, actually client before he became a good friend. Mikhail joined us to talk, both about his experience as a client, and we also had conversations about, him as a dad, me as a dad, of course. Both of our oldest are actually around the same age and have known each other since they were little. But we got to talk about that, talk about the client experience, and then talk about sort of how Mikhail sees the world also as a dad and a business owner who's been through the family law process. And that was important to me. I mean, one, because Mikhail's really dear to my heart and a very close friend, but also just the way we met and the way our paths crossed and kind of starting out in that attorney-client relationship and then developing to what it has over the years. It was nice to share that with everybody. It was really nice of him to join us. So I like that. And then, of course, we did a jury trial series recently. And for those of y'all who follow the podcast or, follow the website or both, that jury trials are something that Brian and I like talking about a lot. I think it's one of the areas of the law, areas of practicing family law that we really can bring a particular skill set to the courtroom that we've honed over the years. That's one of our many differentiators, but that's one that we really enjoy talking about, and frankly sharing with clients and sharing with listeners, sharing with other lawyers our experience. Right, we never view any of this stuff as a huge secret. We like sharing the knowledge and experience that we've gained because us learning from other folks is how we've learned and improved ourselves as lawyers. So kind of walking through the jury trial, since that is sometimes considered to be the great unknown for a lot of both clients and lawyers. I really enjoyed walking through that series. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I agree on the jury trial series. I did a couple of episodes recently with two out-of-state lawyers, just kind of comparing the different legal systems in our different states. One was from Colorado, one was from Washington State, and but also discussing the issues of what happens if you have connections to both states, or you've lived there, or you just moved from one state, or you've got to modify someone and the kids are now living in a different state, or just moved to Texas, or something along those lines. So I always find those interesting. It's really interesting how we have 50 different family law systems in a lot of ways. Especially as it relates to property division and divorce. And so it was interesting talking to those two folks, at least, and Ryan. We've also had a series about understanding the cost of a case. And I get this question. I mean, if it's not 100% of the time, it's 98% of the time, right? I just answered it this morning in an email to a potential client. I kind of, how much is it going to cost, right? I mean, it's a really important question. It's related to the question of how long is this going to take? Very similar answers to both of those. So that's really useful, I think, especially for new clients or someone who's in an existing case and wondering, is it normal for me to be spending this much on my lawyer, or is that abnormal? So
right, or the normal for me to spend that much. And when I ask my lawyer, how much is this going to cost moving forward, not getting even an answer. So that was probably one of my favorite episodes too, just because I think it shows of who we are as a law firm. We actually want to put out there as much information as we can, including information that most lawyers won't address or just refuse to address with their clients. And I was really proud that not only do we do that with our clients, but, Brian, you went through and really talked about, put it out there for everybody, even if they don't hire us, right? Everybody. This is kind of what a divorce should look like or a child custody case should look like.
Yep, absolutely. And we also have a new pop culture series for a little variety about talking about, famous people in the news going through family law issues, which, is evidently there's never a shortage of that. So we've started to do that. We'll try that a few times, see how it's received, and then we'll go from there. So
yeah, it's you and I trying to appear up to speed and cool. So I think we've done a decent job so far. And then, we've had these trending topics that, I'm sure you've noticed it, Brian. I noticed it. This is kind of the season and post holidays and kind of engagement season and wedding season. We get a lot of calls about prenuptial agreements. Of course, sometimes post-nuptial agreements as well. And so episode 86 addresses that head on. I think a lot of people will find that resourceful. And then, Brian, can you talk about what's coming up on the podcast? We got the next 10 series. I know we have some interesting things coming up.
Despite us not having any particular training or maybe even great skill, this podcast has not only been going on a while, but has gotten to the point where we start to have people from all over the country contacting us and saying, other podcasters or other professionals saying, hey, I'd love to do a podcast with you guys. And so we're going to do, and I mentioned a moment ago doing that with some other lawyers out of state, but this one is another podcaster, and we're going to discuss step-parent rights, which is, again, something we hear about a lot and have a lot of questions about. And it's increasingly, a common issue and problem. So that's coming up soon, and it'll be with a prominent other person, which should spread the word even a little bit better. And then we're going to, another thing that's distinctive about our firm is that we'll handle a case in any place in Texas. I mean, obviously, most of our practice is concentrated where most of the population lives, which is in the big urban centers where we have our four big offices. But we'll handle counties anywhere in the state. And on top of that, there are very big differences. If you live in Dallas, there's sort of four big counties. Two of them are more urban, two of them are suburban, but there's also another 5 or 6 counties around those 4 counties that are places that people who live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area live in, and cases are there. And so we're going to cover some of those different counties, some of the more common ones here soon. So if you live in Harris County, Dallas County, Travis County, wherever you live, or one of the outlying counties, you might be interested to know that there are differences between different counties, different judges, different procedures, different perceived different views you might get on a jury, for example. So we're going to do that, and we're going to do that with some of our local associate attorneys in those other areas that practice in those counties quite a bit. So I'm pretty interested to hear that. I think that's going to be pretty interesting. So good. Well, we had some listener questions. You want to take the first of those?
Yeah, I'll read one and go ahead and answer it. Then I'll pose the next one to you, Brian. Somebody asked, if I'm expecting to receive an inheritance, how would that be divided if my spouse and I end up in a divorce? Should I consider a postmarital agreement? So let's sort of take it two-pronged, right? There's a question kind of about how is it going to be divided if I'm going through a divorce, and then should I consider a postmarital agreement? So first of all, the inheritance, if you're receiving an inheritance, for those who all know from our other episodes, an inheritance would be separate property. If you remember, separate property is property that you own before marriage, property that was gifted, inherited, or personal injury recoveries that don't include loss of earnings. So inheritance is going to be your separate property. So if I'm inheriting $100,000 from my dad, or if somebody left with me or what have you, that's my separate property. Now remember, it's going to be my burden at final trial to prove that that's my separate property, right? And that's going to have to be proved by clear and convincing evidence. And we see a lot of people get jammed up on that if they receive an inheritance and it kind of goes all over the place, and maybe somebody got spent on living expenses, which won't be reimbursable, or, I'm not sure where it's at. And so if you're receiving an inheritance and you do wish to protect it, First step would be make sure to segregate it. I usually tell people open up a separate account. If this is something that you and your spouse want to do and you want to protect your inheritance, open up a separate account, put it there, just so it's clearly segregated and it's easier to trace and carry your burden of proof if in the unfortunate event that you end up going through a divorce. And so then it would not, if you can prove that that's your inheritance is your separate property, then it won't be divided. It'll just be confirmed as your separate property as the court. Also remember though, like we talked about in prior episodes, income off of separate property is community property in the state of Texas. So if I stick that 100,000, in my scenario, I can inherit 100,000. If I stick it in a brokerage account, which is, interest and dividends each month, that's going to be community property. It's going to be reinvesting the account, and that's why we have to do line item tracing, which, isn't horribly difficult, but can be considered if money's moved around or what have you. So it is a good idea to segregate it. As far as a postmarital agreement could probably address this in two ways. One, it's just the basic identity of, here's where the inheritance is. Always a premarital agreement, a postmarital agreement. One of the many things that they could do is make sure that we're identifying assets that are separate. And the other thing that a postmarital agreement can do is you could agree that the income off that separate property remains separate. That's something that we commonly see both in premarital agreements and postmarital agreements. And then you don't have that tracing issue. You don't have to worry about it getting what we call commingled, where the interest and dividends are getting reinvested and we're not sure what's separate and what's community. That's something that can be done if the spouses agree. But at a minimum, if somebody's talking about receiving a large sum of money either through inheritance or a gift during the marriage, at a minimum, you should do your best to segregate it so you can identify it easier in the unfortunate event of a divorce. I hope that answers that one. Then Brian, somebody asked, what can I do if my spouse is hiding assets during our divorce?
Well, I think the first question is to kind of prove that, right? I mean, there's often a lack of trust with somebody who's starting to go through a divorce for obvious reasons. Very frequently, trust has been violated in other ways, and so I hear this a lot. I'm not sure what my spouse has done with our money or assets, or why don't we have more money, or things like that. And that's often very much a concern of the spouse who doesn't keep a close eye on the finances, which is the way a lot of people set up their marriages. So one typically manages most of the money, the other one just kind of sits back to some extent, although everybody's different. So first of all, we need to figure that out. Generally, that's not that hard to do if there really is hiding of assets, because it's their money comes in. If people are typically like they do, they're employed, they get a paycheck, you can trace that. You can go back and look at the history of those payments, going into which account. Your pay stubs tell you that type of thing. And if money's come out, it's either most commonly going to be some type of wire transfer or withdrawal. I have seen people occasionally, withdraw $300 a week in cash, and for years and years and years, and have that disappear. So we can usually figure that out. The most common practical end of that is transfers of money overseas or to family members, in the guise of, hey, my family back in, my home country is going through some hard times, so I'm going to send them some money. And then we get into, was that agreed to? Was it a loan? Was it a gift? All of those kind of things. Now, the actual hiding of assets is, if it's not that way, which is usually pretty well and easy to figure out, it's going to be in something that's easy to hide. So that's typically either cash, jewelry, gold bullion, that type of thing. And those are more difficult. If you have a business, for example, that generates a lot of cash and it isn't being deposited every day, then that is the kind of thing that can be hidden. Same thing with jewelry. If someone has hundreds of thousands of dollars in jewelry, that is a community asset typically, but it's not unusual in cases as well. Oh, what jewelry? I don't have any jewelry, or I sold that, or those type of things. And so those can be more difficult to do. But if we can show that a spouse has been hiding assets during the divorce, the court will order it to be returned, or if it's not in some form that can be returned, compensate a spouse out of other assets or award a judgment or things like that. And generally, the court's going to be really upset if you can prove that and do all kinds of bad things to that person who's been hiding assets, impose attorney fees, provide a disproportionate division of the assets, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and court's not gonna put up with that if it can be proven.
Exactly. Last question somebody asked, and I'll answer it. It says, I signed our prenuptial agreement blindly without fully understanding the agreement. What are my options in getting that changed before we start the divorce process? So the family code does address enforcement of a postmarital agreement. And, it's good to know that we do have a public policy on enforcing premarital agreements, right? The case law is that we start from the presumption that we are wanting to enforce these. Now, depending on how it was done, right, a court may not enforce a premarital agreement if it was done under duress. And it's really clear. It's important to know that under duress means more than just, he pressured me or she pressured me. But rather, literally, somebody's threatening to do an illegal act to you if you don't sign it. Or it's if the agreement was what we call unconscionable when it was signed. And it's not just enough to say it's unconscionable. It's not just enough to come in and say it's unfair. This is ridiculous. That's unconscionable when it's signed. And that before signing it, that you didn't receive a fair disclosure of the property or financial obligations of the other party, or you did not voluntarily expressly waive the right to disclosure, so you weren't given a disclosure, and you didn't waive disclosure, and you couldn't have known on your own, did not have reasonably or could not have had adequate knowledge of the property or financial obligations. So the unconscionable burden is really high. Obviously the duress one is too, right? Either somebody committed duress where you didn't sign the agreement voluntarily or not. The unconscionable burden is really high because most of the times, if a good lawyer's drafted these premarital agreements, they're going to both provide a disclosure and both voluntarily waive the disclosure. And if you've done those things, then it could be extremely difficult, maybe impossible to undo the premarital agreement. They are very, very serious documents, both premarital and postmarital agreements. And every single case is different. Every single case is fact specific, but you need to know from a general proposition, premarital agreements are a very serious document, and you should have a lawyer look it over. People can always amend them. They can revoke them. They can add to them. But before sort of going through the divorce process, if that's where you're at, it's best to set up a consultation with a board certified lawyer, have the premarital agreement so she or he can review it. And then that way you kind of have a full picture of what it would look like if you did go through a divorce. But they're serious documents. It's something you're going to want to bring up immediately when consulting with a lawyer.
Yeah, I'll add one quick thing to that, which is I do these fairly often, and I get a lot of, here's the Word version of the prenup, and I'm pretty sure we signed the same thing. And it's important to bring to that lawyer the actual signed prenup with everybody's signature on it. So that would be helpful. So yeah,
absolutely. And I've had factual disputes about whether or not this was actually signed or not. I had one recently where, what they do, it did not waive the disclosure in the premarital agreement, but it had attached a disclosure, right? So the premarital agreement didn't waive the disclosure. There was no way that my client could have known about the husband's finances. But it did have a disclosure attached to it, which typically would mean that it's binding if it's, even if it is unconscionable, and it was clearly unconscionable. but they initialed, every single page was initialed except for the disclosures. And the disclosures weren't, which was really suspicious, right? It's like, and our client, I think they had been married 20 years or something, and said, I never initialed a disclosure. I never saw it. And so that's a factual dispute about whether or not the disclosure was made. So that just goes back to every single case is fact specific. And it's just really, really important to consult with a lawyer on those things. If you have a premarital agreement, a postmarital agreement, and it's really, really important to consult a lawyer before signing a premarital or a postmarital agreement, because they are serious documents. Can't emphasize that enough. So those are great questions. I mean, that's what we love about the podcast, right? We have podcasters from other states reaching out to us and asking us to do podcasts with them. We're getting great listener questions from y'all, great feedback. We really appreciate it. We get phone calls at the office all the time, sometimes for potential new clients, sometimes folks that are just looking for more information. We love that. That's what this podcast is for. I'm just really happy that we've, on episode 90 and still going strong, and hope y'all are enjoying it. So that's what we have for today. Like I was just saying, if you like what you've heard today, please do us a favor and leave us a review. We appreciate all the feedback that we get, and that we've gotten, especially when it helps us better the podcast. So if you have any questions, just please reach out to us at podcast@waltersgilbreath.com. You can, of course, find us on our website and contact us there as well. So I'm Jake Gilbreath, joined by Brian Walters, and thank you for listening.
For information about the topics covered in today's episode and more, you can visit our website at waltersgilbreath.com. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of For Better, Worse, or Divorce, where we post new episodes every first and third Wednesday. Do you have a topic you want discussed or a question for our hosts? Email us at podcast@waltersgilbreath.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time.